Well, most normal speakers, when they get to level 2 and do their leadership style speech, talks about their own leadership, or they share inspiring stories of great leadership. Sorry, not tonight. I'm going to talk about bad leaders. I mean truly awful leaders. I'm going to reach back into history and bring up examples of leaders who through their style could take normal, decent, law-abiding people and make them do truly terrible things. How did they do that? And I mean really bad leaders. Leaders like Pol Pot, who led the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia in the 1970s, where they wiped out 1 out of every 4 people in the country. Or Stalin in the Great Terror, or Mao in the Great Leap Forward. How did they take regular people and convince them to do that with their leadership? And I'll use an example of the most famous awful leader that you all know. One who in August 1933 came to power in Germany as the head of the Nazi Party. This was a country that was a democracy. They had human rights, they had free elections, and within 10 years, they didn't just start World War II. German people worked together to build and operate extermination camps where over 6 million people died, many of them their fellow citizens. How did he convince them to do that? I'll talk about 5 techniques of these terrible leaders in history. First, they took people's fears and pain and they presented to them a scapegoat, a group of people who are responsible for their troubles. In Germany, it was the Jewish people, people who were presented as this secret force that controls the banks and finance. They control the politics that got us into this trouble. They created all these troubles because in 1930s, Germany had just lost World War I and people were humiliated. And the penalties that the other powers that won World War I imposed were these penalties that bankrupted Germany, that wiped out their currency. So people had their life savings wiped out, many lost their jobs, people were really struggling. And so his first technique was to take all that trouble and say, here's some people. They did it to you. They're the ones responsible. A second technique is he would take his enemies, whether they were communists or the Jewish people, and he would present them as maybe a little bit less than human. He would describe them in all his speeches as things like a disease on the country or parasites taking away our country. Because for people to do truly terrible things, they won't do that to other people. So you have to convince them, and all those leaders did, convince them that those enemies are not quite the same as you. A third technique is always make sure you control all the media. You have a big propaganda. So in your country, people cannot get another story. Get rid of free press. Get rid of free speech. Don't let people understand deeply. Make sure they only understand the government story of what's the problem. All 3 of these things exist in all those terrible leaders I talked about. And most of them also would make sure that society is very violent. I mean, in the Cultural Revolution, there was the Red Guard, these kids running around, causing chaos. In Germany, it was a group called the Brown Shirts, just kind of making people more scared. And then the final technique of these terrible leaders is you can't become awful right away. You have to take away people's freedoms step by step, a little bit at a time. Each step is kind of bad, but it's not enough for people to all band together and stop you. In English, there's this phrase of the boiling frog. You know, this idea that if you have really hot water and you put a frog in, it'll go, ah, that's hot, and he'll jump right out. He won't agree. But if you put them in regular water and you slowly heat it up, they won't jump out. By the time they realize what's going on, it's too late. And that was a technique of all of these leaders. They would do it a little bit at a time, and before people figured it out, it was too late. Now, why am I going into this terrible leadership example? Well, number one, I'm a history geek, and I find this stuff interesting of how they could do it. But number two, as we stand here at the beginning of 2026, I think before us is a bright future with amazing technologies. But there are some risks. There are some risks of this kind of leader here and there throughout the world. The world economic order that the countries have all operated under is kind of starting to break down a little bit with trade wars. The military alliances, the balances of power, the international groups that have kept the peace since World War II, they're getting a little shaky these days. And when we look at things like AI or automation, it may be wonderful, but it might also bring a lot of disruption to society. There might be a lot of people who lose their jobs or get unhappy or don't like those changes. And so I think, and this is one of the reasons I studied history and why I'm making you listen to this awful story, is I think there's a lot of power from understanding the past. That when people look back and they see those lessons and they see how these things can happen, they can avoid being that frog. They can see those techniques and they can band together and get out of that hot water and try and stop them. And so that's why, in addition to not thinking of something else, I wanted to dive into this aspect of leadership, because together and understanding history, it has great power. Back to Jenny.